So at the beginning of 1 Kings 17, we see Elijah being told by God to go and deliver a message to Ahab, king of Israel. And that message is that God is going to send a drought on the land. Now, the reason for this judgment in particular is that Ahab and through his wife Jezebel have brought a new kind of idolatrous worship into Israel, specifically the worship of Baal. Now, this came from Sidon, which is where Jezebel came from. Now, it's not a case of this idolatrous worship in general being new to Israel. From the very foundation of the northern kingdom, there had been a corruption of true worship right from the first king of Israel, Jeroboam the first. He was guilty of bringing in or starting a corrupted version of the worship of Jehovah. He set up his own high places. He created a couple of golden calves reminiscent of the events in Exodus at Mount Sinai. And I think the main reason for him attempting to do this is because he wanted to maintain control over the people who were living in the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. He didn't want them to go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, in the southern kingdom. So he wanted to keep people within the land of Israel and their worship. So he did introduce idolatrous worship, reducing Jehovah to kind of an idol. But what differentiates those things from the events of Ahab and Jezebel and bringing Baal worship is that the two of them introduced a completely brand new religion. So Elijah comes to them, announces this drought that's going to come on the land. God then tells Elijah to go into the wilderness, and he gives him a little bit of an example of his miraculous and non-miraculous provision. That's one of the contrasts we see when we're talking about the remnant, is this comparison. So while he's in the wilderness, a raven provides meat and bread to Elijah in a miraculous fashion, but in a non-miraculous fashion, Elijah gets water to sustain himself from a brook. Now, after a short time, as the drought begins to take effect, God tells Elijah to leave Israel and go to Sidon. And there he will be taken care of by the widow living in Zarephath. And there's some miraculous events there that he has experiences with the widow and her son. But one of the things to note in this particular sequence of events is the irony. So just in a similar fashion, the way Jezebel brought Baal worship from Sidon to Israel, through Elijah, Jehovah worship is going from Israel to Sidon. So we see that by the end of this particular series of events, people in Sidon are worshiping Jehovah. So after about 3 years, God his word comes to Elijah telling him to go back and to see Ahab because he's going to bring an end to this drought. So Ahab packs up, heads back to Israel. On his way to meet Ahab, he meets Obadiah, who happens to be the head of the household, Ahab's household. And Ahab and Obadiah have set out trying to find water. So Obadiah meets Elijah on the road, recognizing him immediately. And Elijah tells him to go tell Ahab because I want to talk to him today. But Obadiah is a bit reluctant because he says, my master Ahab has been searching for you everywhere for the last 3 years. He's gone to different countries and made people swear an oath, whether they've seen you or not. And if I go and tell him that you're here, by the time we come back here to where you are, we might not find you. God will have taken you away somewhere that I know not where. And there's a little bit of, I think, foreshadowing of the events that we know how what's going to happen to Elijah later on. But Elijah reassures Obadiah, no, go tell him, because surely today I'm going to talk to Ahab. So when they do meet, Ahab refers to Elijah as the troubler of Israel, blaming him for all of the things that have happened with the drought. But Elijah reminds him, no, it's not me, it's you. So Elijah makes this suggestion. You're going to have a divine duel between Elijah as the prophet of Jehovah and all of the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. We're going to get together. We'll put these altars with wood. We'll get 2 bulls. They can have one. I'll have one. We'll divide them up. They'll do what they need to do. I'll do what I need to do. Whichever God answers by fire, he's going to be, the God that deserves worship. And important to remember also that Baal was thought to be the god of fire and lightning. So this idea that the God is going to answer by fire is specifically pointed at Baal to refute, his supposed power. That's very similar to the way that the 10 plagues of Egypt in Exodus addressed specifically, the individual gods that the Egyptians worshipped at that time. So again, Elijah comes up with this thing. Great. Everybody seems to agree, thinks it's a good idea. So they go up to Mount Carmel. They get the bulls. Elijah gives the prophets of Baal and Asherah, the courtesy of allowing them to go first. So they spend hours marching around their altar that they've constructed with the sacrifice, just getting louder and louder, making more and more pleas for Baal to answer. They cutting themselves, there's like bloodletting, which the scripture says was according to their fashion. So obviously it's something that they did on a regular, semi-regular basis. But there's nothing, no response. And Elijah somewhat mockingly says, so, maybe you need to speak louder. Maybe he's hard of hearing. Maybe he's in the bathroom and he can't hear you. You got to speak louder. But still nothing. So again, these sequence of events are another one of the contrasts that we see when we're talking about the remnant, this idea of the noise versus the quiet. So with the prophets of Baal, they themselves are making a huge amount of noise, a lot of racket. But in contrast, the heavens are quiet. So eventually, it becomes Elijah's turn. Now, I think the scripture specifically says that it's coming near to the time of the evening oblation, which is, I think, the timing of Elijah's sacrifice is appropriate. It's, it's doing it at the correct time. So he rebuilds an altar, one that had been torn down, puts wood there, puts the bull on top. He digs quite a deep trench around the altar, which has quite a large volume. And then he asks for jars of water to be filled. And they take 4 jars, and he repeatedly gets them to fill them and dump them. So they're dumping all of these jars of water. They end up soaking the sacrifice 3 times with water. So the wood is saturated. The sacrifice, the bowl itself, is wet. Eventually, the trench, this deep trench that he's built around the altar, is also full. And again, with the contrast of the noise and the quiet, Elijah quietly prays he wants God to remember his promises to Israel and acknowledge him or identify him as a true prophet, as the prophet of Jehovah. And in contrast, the heavens, or God answers loudly. Fire comes down from heaven, which is obviously not a natural fire. It's a divine origin, consumes everything, consumes the sacrifice, consumes the wood, even the stones and the dust, and licks up the water in all of the trench. Quite a miraculous sight, which causes the people, the nation of Israel, who had been gathered to witness these events, to fall on their faces, acknowledge, and they repeat, the Lord, he is God. And they repeat that several times. At this point, I think Elijah feels a bit victorious, orders the people to grab the prophets of Baal, don't let them escape. He takes them down to the water's edge, and they are killed. At this point, Elijah tells Ahab, you better get in your chariot and go because rain's coming soon. So Ahab departs. Elijah goes up the hill with his servant, and he asks his servant, while he's kneeling down and praying, he says to the servant, go take a look over the sea and tell me what you see. And this happens several times. Finally, on the seventh time, the servant comes back and says, oh, yes, I see a cloud forming as small as a man's hand out there over the sea. So we know that rain is coming. Elijah heads back to where he's living. At the same time, Ahab has also arrived at home, back home with Jezebel, and tells her what has happened. What has Elijah done? He's gone and killed all your prophets of Baal. So she sends a messenger to Elijah and tells him, I'm going to kill you. You're going to die. Elijah becomes afraid, and he flees with his servant. First, they go to Judah, and his servant is left there. Elijah himself heads off a day's journey into the wilderness and sits down under a rather pathetic tree, which doesn't provide much shade, and just wants to die. An angel appears to him a couple of times and says, well, what are you doing here? Sort of indicating, this is not where you're supposed to be. What's your purpose for being here? Twice Elijah says, I just want to die. I'm no better than my fathers. Basically, I failed. Israel hasn't, repudiated their worship of Baal. They're just going to continue on. What I've done didn't work. So the angel provides some food, some cakes to Elijah, strengthening him. And in fact, it says, that the food sustains him for a 40-day, 40-night journey, which Elijah makes from there to Mount Sinai, going back to the same place where Israel received the Mosaic Law. And there he goes into a cave, and God proceeds to show him some signs. He brings first wind against the mountain. There is an earthquake, and there's also fire battering against this mountain. So these are all physical demonstrations. Those three, again, this contrast of the noise and the quiet. God is not in those things, but there's a fourth sign. There is some verses, some translations talk about a still small voice. Others say a low whisper. This idea of a quiet voice speaking to Elijah. And in that voice, we see God's presence. And that's one of the things Elijah recognizes. Scripture says that he covered his face, which is a common response. an appropriate response to being in God's presence. So these signs that God delivers are prophetic in a sense on what he's going to do to Ahab and the house of Ahab and Jezebel. So even though they're physically against this mountain, when we talk about mountains in scripture being used symbolically, it represents a king, kingdom, or throne. So these judgments are going against the house of Ahab, against Israel. So the wind battering against this mountain is representing Hazael, who will be the king of Syria. He's going to come and attack Israel, and they're going to have a war. The earthquake is Jehu, who's going to be the king of Israel after Ahab. He's going to be his successor. He's largely responsible for a civil war that will occur in Israel, causing some strife. He's going to bring about the end of the house of Ahab as ruling Israel. And then the last sign there is of fire. Fire is representative of Elisha, who is going to be the prophet that succeeds Elijah. And he gains a reputation as being a prophet of death, because as we see or read about the events that Elisha is involved in, often wherever he goes, death follows. So these three people, Elijah is told, to leave where he is, go and anoint these individuals. At the end of 1 Kings 19, we actually see Elijah meeting Elisha. Elijah puts his cloak on Elisha while Elisha is actually plowing a field with his oxen. Through that brief exchange, a brief set of verses, Elisha actually takes those oxen and makes a sacrifice and joins Elijah at the end of that chapter.